All right, we are about to start the form unit. So let's learn a little bit about it and how artists make the best use of this element of design in their work. I'm going to start by talking to you about shape. Um, and let's start here. So a shape is a visually perceived area that's created either by an enclosed line or a color or value change that define the outside edge. And it's two-dimensional. It has height and width. And a design or a composition of arrangement of shapes is usually where people start as they begin to work. And of course, color and texture and value of the shapes are important, but getting down the basic shapes of a composition are usually where we start. And there are pieces that may exist without color or without texture or even without line, but rarely do they exist without shape. Only in the most atmospheric of compositions may there be a void of shape. In this example of the piece called Rain. And also, I thought Monet's Cathedral series was another good example. We can pick out some shapes, but that is not the thrust. The thrust of the piece is the effect of the atmosphere, time of day and year and so forth on the cathedral, which was what he was going for. So when shapes are the thrust of the composition, though, the elements in the piece are usually very flat, and they often balance and color and proportion are carefully arranged, and there's no better example of that than in the Mondrian's work. So here we see rectangles and circles, squares. The composition is based on the weight of each shape, which is established with value, color, and size. And notice the sense of space that's created with these elements, as well as with the feature of overlapping shapes. That also creates a sense of depth. And your knowledge of color now, this will be very familiar, the fact that the orange, red, and yellow dots are jumping forward, and the cooler green, purple, blues are receding. All using shapes. There's really no sense of form in the pieces I've just shown you. Now, form looks like a three-dimensional shape. So you see the shapes of circle, triangle, rectangle, and then the corresponding forms. And the objects look as if they have weight and width and depth. And artists use shading to create the illusion of form. So these lemons are spherical, and the corresponding shape to a sphere is a circle. But the presence of the light source that creates the highlights and shadow, that's what creates a sense of three dimensions and making those lemons look real and weighted and sitting in that bowl. So all form, however complex, is essentially based on and can be reduced to a few geometric shapes. And one of the first tools of drawing from life is the ability to reduce the objects to simple shapes. And one can also then establish the composition before going on and committing detail. Once these shapes are laid down, then the artists begin to add shading and value and a sense of a light source. So it's a great way to start when you're sketching out from life. Light and shadow are considered together, since neither really can exist without the other. And there are a number of interesting things about the appearance of light. For instance, light reflected on a hard, polished, curving surface often just appears as pure white. And light reflected from a soft, dull surface appears to contain some of the color of the surface with which it is reflected. So, in other words, here we see a brown table surface, and there's a lemon that is being reflected right in the surface. Notice that that color is sort of a combination of the brown mixed with the yellow, and that makes it look most realistic. And here you can see that the blue-purple tabletop is present in the shadow on the underside of the oranges, and that there's orange present in the shadow that extends to the right of the oranges. The highlight is the area of an object that is directly illuminated by the light source. And here you can see different light sources and how it affects these three forms. Now here we see two paintings using a very strong light source. We see shadows, we see highlights, we see reflections. And without the use of light and shadow, these objects would look very flat. Here's a great example. Lichtenstein. He indicated no light source, and it's only through the use of line that we can indicate any sense of three dimensions, but this is an extremely flat still life. It is the use of value and gradations of dark and light that suggest volume, space, and form. And while we have a whole other unit on value, I think it's important just to touch on some of the aspects of value, because you can't create the illusion of form without knowing about value. It's the gradations of light and dark. The term value contrast refers to the relationship between the areas of light and dark. And studies have shown that the average eye can see about 40 variations. So limited value contrast results in very restrained, subtle effects in the work. And this result is one of sort of understatement. Whether the range is limited to only lights or lots of darks, that's the effect you get. An extreme contrast of light and dark tend to make for dynamic images and suggest more exciting themes and present much more vibrant and dynamic images. So high contrast of value. Value alone can dictate the mood of a piece, and the value is often the result of the quality of the light suggested in the work. All right, so shape is usually considered to be a two-dimensional element, and the word form is what we just talked about in capturing the sense of three dimensions in an illusional way. And volume and mass are applied to sculpture, right? So in terms of paintings, we have the illusion of form, but when we talk about sculpture, we talk about volume and mass. A flat work, such as a painting, can be viewed satisfactorily from only a limited number of angles and offers approximately the same image regardless of the angle. So you can move to the right or left of a painting, but really that's about it. But three-dimensional works can be viewed from countless angles as you move around them. So unless we stand still, our visual experience is always very fluid and non-static when looking at a sculpture. So thus, in composing art in actual three dimensions, volume and mass must be considered. The artist, it's much more complex in terms of what your considerations are as you work. We may step back to view the progress of a painting or a drawing, but with a sculpture, we must consider multitude of angles. A multitude of angles, and actually consider what the viewer is going to experience. And as you can see in this example, the piece looks very different from one side to another. So a sharp distinction between two and three-dimensional forms is not always possible or desired. And in this case, relief sculptures, they are 3D because there's a carving or a raised area that lifts off the surface. But their actually function is they're more like paintings without color. You certainly can create a relief form and add color to it. But reliefs are sort of that in-between place. And I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about that. Many artists today are incorporating three-dimensional objects by adding items to a canvas or presenting them with a canvas. And there's Jennifer Bartlett's Boats as a great example. So in our day-to-day lives, we are surrounded by three-dimensional objects, and it would make sense that many artists would find their voice through creating 3D pieces. There are numerous materials and techniques with which to sculpt. Here we see carving and modeling. But there's also construction and casting. There's assemblage art, where you bring objects together to create something. One can use plaster or clay. This artist is using plaster gauze, cement, foam, metals, paper, wood, soap, mud, straw, wax. It's a very potent art form. There are important aspects to sculpture that you have to think about. One of them is its relationship to gravity, and will it affect the stability of your piece? And so you have to plan on that, right? You have to consider, will your piece stand and actually have presence and not topple over? And in some cases, maybe your piece will be about gravity. The use of an armature is important sometimes in pieces, and many materials can be used to support the inside of a piece of work, so that you put this thing inside the work to hold the outside. It's called an armature. Tactile concern. Sometimes the surface of the sculpture is the star of the show. A base can anchor a piece visually or ground it. So in the example of the hand, without the base sticking out to the left, if you just had that hand on the ground, it would most likely tip over to your left because of weight. And so a base is often needed to keep the sculpture grounded and visible without tipping over. Color. Color is a consideration. It can alter the mood or the message. Sculptures often make a strong appeal to our sense of touch. And public bronze sculptures often have shiny areas where they've been touched over the years by the public. And the way this takes place is that bronze, of course, is a golden color, but sort of a dark gold. But when it's exposed to air and elements, it turns green. It's called a patina. And many times artists will actually add water and surfaces and vinegar to bring the patina up quickly, rather than wait for the elements to turn it from a bronze color to a greenish color. But that green oxidation can be easily rubbed off. And so you can see that people sit down next to this sculpture and touch it. And that's why you can see that dark gold on the knee and on the hand. Capturing the essence of an object is often the goal of a sculpture. Rather than trying to reproduce something exactly like this, you may want to just suggest a figure. I would say there's a figure there, right? The form of a sculpture is described by its surface, which encourages the eye to move around the sculpture. The way its surface is defined determines sometimes how well a viewer can make sense of what the sculpture is. There are examples of solid sculptures or open, weighted sculptures or light, soft or hard. There is so much to consider when sculpting. The surface, the weight, the way it occupies space, and how it will be displayed. That needs to be considered. So that gives you a sense of how artists either capture the illusion of three dimensions and form, or whether they actually work with materials to produce weight and mass and create forms that way. And so the assignment, of course, is to create a piece in which the emphasis is on form. If you work two-dimensionally, you absolutely need to present a piece that creates the illusion of a three-dimensional form. Even though you're working in a drawing or a painting, we need to feel the three-dimensional qualities. And of course, that's going to be through light and shadow. And if you're working actually three-dimensionally, if you're going to make a sculpture for this unit, we want to avoid anything that doesn't completely require 360-degree viewing. So we don't want wall pieces, right? Because that you can't get behind the piece. Let's avoid reliefs because they really are not very as 3D as we're going for. Or pieces that are frontal. In other words, the frontal pieces is a piece you'd put on a pedestal, but you'd put the pedestal against a wall. We want pieces that we can see all the way around. We are going to shift to a demonstration next class In the clay room, I'm going to teach you how to create something three-dimensionally. You're going to work for just a few days on that. And then, of course, you'll have your window of time to work in whatever material you choose and create a piece for our critique on form. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoy the unit.